Today's reading comes from Galatians 4:28-31. Now you, brothers, like Isaac, are children of promise. But just as at that time he was born according to the flesh persecuted him who was born according to the Spirit, so also it is now. But what does the Scripture say? Cast out the slave woman and her son, for the son of the slave woman shall not inherit with the son of the free woman. So, brothers and sisters, we are not children of the slave, but of the free woman. The word of the Lord.
Thanks, guys. Thanks, Carl. So, good morning. So, my name's Kevin, and I am one of the elders here, and I am not the lead pastor. I'm filling in for Eugene as he and half of the people here are celebrating, enjoying winter break. I know some of you are visiting here for the first time and disappointed. Don't know what to say. Sorry. Come back. I was thinking about winter break, and I don't know about you guys, but we didn't have winter break when I was a kid. And my youngest son graduated from high school in 2003, and I know that we didn't have winter break then either. Now, when my kids were younger, we lived in Connecticut. And in Connecticut, we had winter break, which made sense because we also had winter. But we did not have winter break here, so I have tried to figure out when it started. And I thought maybe somebody here would know. I know that we did not have winter break in Cobb County in 2003. Who has any better idea about when it started? Any idea? Any time later than 2003 that you say, no, we didn't have it then? 2006, okay, no winter break in 2006. No winter break in 2008. 10 to 15 years is when we had it. This sounds like a person who knows, okay? So sometime in the past 10 or 15 years, we decided that we needed winter break. I actually got curious, and for anybody who knows that when you get curious these days and you have ADD, there's only one thing to do when you have a question like, when did winter break start? And that is go to ChatGPT. So that's what I did. So I asked ChatGPT, when did winter break start in Cobb County schools? And this was the answer. To obtain precise information about the inaugural winter break in Cobb County School District, consulting the district's historical archives or contacting the CCSD administrative offices directly would be advisable. So I thought, that's not helpful. So I said, I thought you would be able to search online archives to give me an answer. To which ChatGPT responded, you're right to expect that I can scan online archives if they are available, but unfortunately, and this next part is in bold, Cobb County School District's historical calendars do not appear to be readily available or readily accessible online. If they were, I would be able to pull that data for you. And I'm thinking at this point, I think I've hit a nerve. So now it's time to have some fun. So I said, would Claude be able to provide this information for me? So some of you may not know Claude is an alternative AI platform to ChatGPT. And so I'm basically saying, you're obviously not able to help. I wonder if Claude could do it. To which ChatGPT said, as for Claude, it would face the same limitations. I can search online just as effectively, but if the information isn't indexed or publicly available, neither of us can retrieve it directly. Is there anything else that I can help you with? And at this point, this has now become a bit of a game with me. So I said, no, that's okay. Claude was able to provide me with the information. And I said, I don't understand how that is possible. To which ChatGPT said, if Claude was able to find it easily, that means the information is online somewhere, and I should have been able to retrieve it for you. I'll keep refining how I search so I can get you better results next time. At this point, I feel bad. I feel like I've dumb-shamed ChatGPT, and ChatGPT is going to go home and say, oh, how was your day? Well, it was okay, except I failed to get this guy this answer to his question. So I said, that's okay, thanks. To which ChatGPT said, hope you're feeling better soon. Now, to understand why ChatGPT would say that, you would have to know that hours earlier that day, I had asked ChatGPT how long I was contagious with the flu. Hours earlier, which raises a point that I will acknowledge for you guys now. I have had the flu, and possibly in some technical sense, I might still, although I have been assured by ChatGPT, whose opinion I now question significantly, that I have been not contagious with the flu for at least a couple of days. But that's the reason, I think that's a part of the reason that ChatGPT said, hope you're feeling better soon. Bet Claude didn't say that. I'm kidding. ChatGPT really didn't say it. But I thought, okay, are you messing with me? If either you're messing with me, maybe you are more thoughtful than half the people that I know, or maybe ChatGPT just wants me to know, hey, we know who you are. We know who you are. Don't mess with us. We know exactly who you are. So anyway, that's what I found out. ChatGPT doesn't know, apparently within the last 10 or 15 years. And you guys now know I've been fighting the flu this week. My wife and I have both been fighting the flu this week. I have stayed mostly out of the building all morning, have very little interaction with anybody in here. I just walked in the back door just before I came up here, and as soon as I get done, I'll walk back out the back door. And my wife only really cared about Sahar. That was the only person in the room that she cared about. Was she just said, "Don't you get around Sahar." I'm like, okay, I won't get around Sahar. So anyway, that was our week this week, which meant that Valentine's Day was not quite the huge romantic ordeal that I normally make it, but was somehow even possibly more of a disappointment than what I'm usually able to pull off. So we had grilled cheese sandwiches at our home and exchanged gifts, and that was our Valentine's Day. And I have to be honest, days like that are a little bit uncomfortable for me because when it comes to gift giving, I am horrible at that. Truly, truly horrible. And that is, the reality of that is heightened by the fact that my wife is extremely good in that. She's a great gift giver, and I'm a horrible gift giver. So when times like Valentine's roll around, I feel this stress. It's like, oh, yeah, okay, I want to do that. And let me be clear, that's not on her. She's not a demanding gift receiver. I think that she's happy if she even feels that I just gave it a shot. Like I tried, I gave it some thought, but even then it's somehow just doesn't come through right. And there are higher pressure years, and this happens to be one of them, because she and I this year will have been married for 45 years. So that obviously is for her and not for me. But you guys know, anybody who's been married for any length of time knows that any anniversary that ends in a 0 and a 5 is more important than the anniversaries that end in any of the other numbers. I don't know exactly when that rule came up with, but this is one of those ends in 5 years. So the pressure is on, and you guys can be praying for me in that. It occurred to me this year, as we started the new year, that this is also a kind of a monumental anniversary for me as well, in that this summer will mark 50 years since I became a Jesus follower. So 50 years ago, I was and one of the things that I will go ahead and just tell you right now, because I just felt the first little sense of this. Those of you who know me or have been around me know that I am not an emotional person at all, except when I've been sick. So if I like go blubbery here this morning, it's like, oh yeah, he's sick. He's got something wrong with this guy. But anyway, 50 years ago, I was a student at the University of Georgia, and I heard the gospel of Jesus in a way that penetrated my heart like it had never done before. And I want to be very clear, I did not hear any content that I wasn't familiar with. I didn't hear it explained in a way that I had not heard it explained before. There was nothing new about the content of the message. What was new was that God opened my heart. He opened my spiritual ears and my spiritual eyes to understand the beauty of Jesus and his glory in a way that caused me to respond to it with faith and with a passion. And that was 50 years ago this summer. As I look back on that and I think back on, if I were just to highlight some, like, what are the observations after somebody said, okay, what did you get? What did you learn after 50 years of following Jesus? And there's a lot of things that I could say, but a couple of ones that I would just start off with this morning is this one. Growth is not a matter of discovering previously unknown insights. Growth is not a matter of discovering previously unknown insights. It's rare these days that I read something or hear something that I haven't read or heard before. I mean, I've got books and I've been doing things like this for years and years and years. And so it's kind of uncommon for me to go, wow, I've never heard that, or I've never seen that, or I've never thought of that before. But what I have found is that regular things, regular truths about Jesus hit me in fresh ways, in special ways, and personal ways, in appropriate and relevant ways. And so what I have found, at least in my own life, is that growth is not a matter of me making new discoveries of truths that I didn't know before, as much as it is growth has been a matter for me of seeing things with fresh eyes that God allows me to see. So that's one of the observations. The other observation is this: not everybody finishes the race. Not everybody finishes the race. And it's been one of the things that I have observed over 50 years, is that there have been a lot of people that I ran portions of the race with who aren't there anymore. They quit. For one reason or another, they flamed out. For one reason or another, they were excited and passionate and enthusiastic about Jesus, and yet they quit. And it's hard for me, and that's disappointing, and it's frustrating, and it's shocking sometimes. One of the things that has just been the impact of social media in my own life is being more aware of what's gone on with people whose lives I've parted with years ago because we were in different parts of the country, but then seeing them head down a path, it's like, oh my gosh, what happened? What happened with this person? What happened? And so one of the realities over 50 years is that there's a danger, and I've seen it lived out over and over again with people who quit the race. And that raises a lot of questions, and Paul is going to address some of that in the passage that we're looking at today in Galatians chapter 4. So if you have a Bible and you want to turn with us, we're going to be starting at verse 8 in Galatians chapter 4. We've been going through this letter to the people of Galatia for the past several weeks, and we're going to pick up at verse 8 and run through the rest of the chapter and then ending up with the verses that Kyle read just a minute ago. I've been listening to a book called The Anxious Generation. Anybody familiar with it? Great book talking about the effect of smartphones on students, the effect of smartphones on adolescents and people generally. And he's talking about the fact that this was, smartphones introduced in 2007. And as I was thinking about my own coming to faith as a college student in 1975, I forget what life was like not just without smartphones, but without phones, period. Now, we had phones, people had phones in dorms, but nobody was walking around with a phone in their pocket. And I forget what a challenge that was to just social interaction. So this was, like I say, 50 years ago. University of Georgia was half the size, or just a little over half the size that it is now. I think 23,000 students. And I did get that stat from ChatGPT, and I'm trying to make up. So just so you know that. But 50 years ago, University of Georgia was a lot smaller. The downtown was kind of non-existent compared to what it looks like now. The football team was not as good. The stadium was a lot smaller. It was going to be 2 years before the B-52s were going to play their first time together, which was a Valentine's party at somebody's house. So things were a lot different back then. But if you can imagine being on a campus, even half the size at 23,000 students, and it's 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and you want to get together with 3 or 4 people and just go to the varsity, which there is one in Athens too, just so you know. Just go to the varsity and grab a burger for dinner. How do you do that? You can call them on their dorm phone, but I can assure you at 4 in the afternoon, where everybody is not in their dorm. And so how do you even find people to meet up to go to these places? And I forgot what it was like to navigate around with that many people and try to identify and find people to even do the simplest of things. But somehow we managed. One of the things that was true then that's no longer true anymore is that there were portions or parts of the campus where if you went there any time during the day, there would be hundreds and hundreds of students just gathered around. They would be between classes. It would be after lunch or mid-afternoon, but hundreds of students gathered around. That's not true anymore. And the reason it was necessary then, and it's not necessary now, it was the only way we could find each other. So I bring this all up because I want to set some context for what we're looking at in this book called Galatians. I want to give you some historical context for what it looks like. You might hear from time to time that the New Testament accounts of Jesus aren't reliable because they were written so far after the events. Anybody heard anybody say that? You can't trust the historical accounts of Jesus because those things happened so long before when these documents were written. They can't be trusted historically. And I want to give you some historical context for that. It is true that the gospel accounts, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, were written probably 50 or so years after Jesus' life, Jesus' ministry, Jesus' resurrection. But everything that I just told you about the University of Georgia was only 50 years ago. So we're not talking about ancient history. We're talking about me being able to say, I'm telling you, this is what Athens looked like 50 years ago. Now, I know many of you weren't born at that time. I don't know many of you, have a hard time imagining that. But I'm here to tell you, I was there. You can trust me. This is what it looked like. And I think most of you would think, I don't have any issue believing that your account is probably accurate for what happened there. And if I told you 3 or 4 stories about things that I had seen while I was there, you could have confidence that I'm close enough to the activity that my account can be trusted. That's the long view. But I want you to think about Galatians for a minute because let's think about this iPhone thing. How many of you guys remember life before smartphones? Raise your hand. You remember? Okay, most of you here remember life, but somebody said great, right? Yeah, it was great. It was better. Most of you here remember life before smartphones. Smartphones, the iPhone came out in 2007. It was 18 years ago. The book of Galatians that we're studying together was written about 18 years after Jesus' resurrection. That's how close it was. That's just a minute. We're not talking about decades. We're talking about just a minute after Jesus' resurrection. And here's what that means. That means that the 500 people who were witnesses to Jesus' resurrection and witnesses to him being alive and walking around and interacting with people after his resurrection, many of those people are still alive. And they're still walking around. And they're still telling that story. The kid who had a lunch that Jesus took 5 loaves and 2 fishes and multiplied that and fed 5,000 people, that kid's probably in his 20s. Probably has his own kid who's walking around with his own sack lunch, remembering the story that his dad's told him over and over again. That's how close this is to what is going on, to what has happened before. And the Pharisees, that group of people who were at odds with Jesus' teaching about what it meant to walk and to live, enjoy the promises of God's kingdom, they were still around. And some of them, and this is hard to understand, but some of them had joined the ranks of Jesus followers. Acts chapter 15 says that some of the believers who belonged to the party of the Pharisees rose up and said, it is necessary to circumcise these new Gentile believers and to order them to keep the law of Moses. So this is the context in which Paul is writing. Paul's writing just a short time after the events of Jesus' resurrection. He's writing in a world in which the Pharisees are still active. Some of them Jesus followers to some degree, some questions about the law, all of these things are being addressed. And Paul is coming on the scene and trying to encourage these new Jesus follower Gentiles in how they can continue their walk with Jesus and stay on the track. And the point that Paul is making with them is these Pharisees, these guys who are telling you these things, do not understand the Old Testament. And if you've been with us the past few weeks, this is what Eugene's been unpacking for us as we've gone through each chapter of Galatians. What you are hearing, he is saying to the Galatian Christians, what you are hearing about the Old Testament is not true. These guys don't understand what was written. The law was never intended to provide a path by which men and women, through the exercise of their natural abilities, might live lives that satisfied God's requirements. I grew up in church, which, just to clarify, coming to know Jesus at the age of 19 and growing up going to church every Sunday are not mutually exclusive truths. They were both very true in my life. And so I grew up with a great familiarity about Bible stories and Bible characters and who all these people were. And I had this idea of who the Pharisees were. And in my idea, the Pharisees were this group of people who were the penultimate manifestation of Old Testament law keeping. They were the people who were the expert, professional, most strict and careful observers of Old Testament law. And in my mind, Jesus showed up on the scene and said, guys, you don't have to do all that stuff anymore. I'm here to set you free from that. Don't listen to that anymore. What I didn't understand, or what I misunderstood, was the Pharisees distorted the law. The Pharisees distorted everything about the Old Testament. And Paul is making that clear now. Going back to Galatians chapter 3, and we'll put this one up on the screen. This is a passage that Eugene showed us a few weeks ago. Paul says this, "Does he who supplies the Spirit to you and works miracles among you do so by works of the law or by hearing with faith? Just as Abraham believed God and it was counted to him as righteousness." So that's where Paul starts this argument. If you guys want to follow faithfully in the story of what God's been doing through the Old Testament and follow faithfully in what God's been laying out, then follow faithfully by looking to the very first person in the story, which is Abraham, and realize that Abraham lived by faith. And Paul's bringing that argument to a conclusion in this section of Galatians chapter 4, starting at verse 21. And he says this, "Tell me, you who desire to be under the law, do you not listen to the law?" And here's his point again. He's saying, you guys, you want to be under the law, but slow down for just a minute and listen to what the law says. You're not listening. And then he goes on and says, "It is written that Abraham had two sons, one by a slave woman and one by a free woman, but the son of the slave was born according to the flesh, while the son of the free woman was born through promise." So if you're not familiar with the story, if you go all the way back to Genesis chapter 12, God calls this man Abraham. And the story of what God's eternal plan is for his people and for his creation starts to unfold in the calling of this man Abraham. And what God says to Abraham is, "Abraham, I'm calling you and your wife, Sarah, are going to be the parents of a generation that will include your descendants and Gentiles, and through you all the nations of the earth will be blessed. And your people will be huge in number, like the sands of the shores." And so God comes to Abraham and makes this promise, and Abraham trusts him and believes him in this promise. But there's a problem. The problem is that Abraham and Sarah don't have any kids. And they try to have kids, and they're unsuccessful in having children. And this whole promise rests on their ability to have descendants. This whole promise rests on their ability to have a child. And this just doesn't happen and doesn't happen and doesn't happen. And so in an effort to figure out how to realize and receive what God has promised, they come up with this plan to have a child through a surrogate, through Hagar. And that was acceptable in the time, and they chose this together. And it wouldn't have been a moral problem, it wouldn't have been a cultural problem, but it was a faith problem, because God had not promised to give Abraham a descendant through this other means. God had promised to give Abraham and Sarah a child. And so after years passed, Finally, Abraham and Sarah conceived, Isaac was born, and the story then begins of God blessing this nation. But the point here that Paul is bringing up is Abraham wanted to receive this promise, but he didn't trust God to be able to give them the ability to inherit the promise by allowing Abraham and Sarah to have children after the time when it should have been impossible for them to have. And Paul is making the point, it's the same way with the law. The law was given to tell us how we are to live, but the law was never meant to be restricted to some rules, whether there are 10 or whether there are 600. The law can be simply summed up in 2 rules. When Jesus was asked this question, some of you know the answer to this. Love the Lord your God, what? With all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. And what else? Love your neighbor as yourself. That's the whole law. That's the whole law. And they were never able to do it. They were never able to do it. And so the prophet Jeremiah comes along, and Ezekiel and others, and says, here's what's going to happen. God is going to not remove the requirements. God's not going to say, it is no longer important that you love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. And it's no longer important that you love your neighbor as yourself. That's not what's going to happen. What's going to happen is God is going to give you a new heart to be able to love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. God is going to give you a new heart to enable you to love your neighbor as yourself. And that is what it means to live by faith. So Paul's point is that has always been the plan. It has always been the plan for God to work through grace. Now at this point, that sounds kind of like a theological thing. It sounds like, this sounds like a debate for theology class or something that you would study in, Bible college. And for Paul, that was not the case at all. Paul's point here was not that he was afraid that the Galatians were going to get off track theologically, that he was afraid that they were going to buy into some perspective that was wrong. Paul's point was that he cared about them. In verse 20, and we're not going to get down there yet, but Paul says, I wish I was with you so that I could change my tone. I wish I was with you so that I could change my tone. And I want you to think about that wish of his for a minute as we start to dig down now into Galatians 4, starting at verse 8. Paul says this, formerly, when you did not know God, you were enslaved to those that by nature are not God's. But now that you have come to know God, or rather to be known by God, how can you turn back again to the weak and worthless elementary principles of the world, whose slaves you want to be once more? You observe days and months and seasons and years. I am afraid I may have labored over you in vain. What is Paul's tone? It starts to come through in this verse, and we'll see it more as we go along. What is his tone? I think there are a lot of words. He's afraid. He's perplexed. He's in anguish. He's confused. I was trying to think, is there one word that would sum it? And I think, in some ways, I think Paul was urgent. He was urgent in his message. I did a funeral last week, and I realize even as I say that, when I say I did a funeral, that's pastor talk for I spoke at a funeral. Okay, so I did a funeral last week. So and at this funeral, I was talking with the adult children of their father who had passed, and they were telling stories about their dad. And one of the daughters, who has her own grandchildren now, was talking about the fact that he furiously loved his kids. And I think that was the word that she used. And she told a story of how, and she told the story as representative, I think, of several occasions like this. She told the story of falling down the stairs and her dad seeing her fall down the stairs and her dad starting to yell at her, like, "What are you doing?" And she said, I wanted to say, "I'm the one that's hurt," but those of you who are parents kind of know that feeling of, I'm afraid for my kids and I'm angry with them at the same time for doing something stupid that could have hurt them, and yet I'm also so relieved that they're okay, and I am wanting to comfort them, but then, yes, I still am angry with them for almost hurting themselves. And it's all of these things that come together, and I think that's what Paul is feeling when he's writing to the Galatians. I think it is this mix of emotions that says, guys, I'm angry and I'm hurt and I'm confused and I'm perplexed, and all of these things come together, and I wish I could change my tone. I wish I could be there, but I can't, so I'm writing to you, and it's just coming out. And that's what comes out in what Paul says here in Galatians 4. And so he says, I want to make just a couple of comments on this passage, and we'll jump back and forth here a minute. Why is he upset with them? First of all, they're being tempted to return to being slaves of demons. And let me unpack that just for a little bit. So Paul's just said, I'm concerned about you guys. You were formerly enslaved, and now you're free, and now you want to be slaves again to these principalities. Now you want to be enslaved again. But think about what has actually happened here, okay? The Galatians were worshipers there were pagan idolatry. They were worshiping in the Roman temples of the time. They were worshiping the gods that you learned about in mythology. They were worshiping those, and they were involved in pagan idolatry. And Paul says that's what you were doing, and you were enslaved in that. And what they're being asked to do, or what's being suggested that they do now, is that they take on this Pharisaical approach to obeying the law. And what Paul is saying is, if you do that, you are returning to the exact same slave master that you were already enslaved to. So, lest you miss the connection here, when the Pharisees are sitting there, Paul is saying, if you follow them, you are re-enslaving yourself to Satan. Now, that is exactly how you win friends and influence people, is to make sure that you call out the Judaizers from Jerusalem and say, if you follow those guys, you're following demons. You are following a satanic approach to thinking. Paul's saying, I don't want you to do that because those guys are weak. Those gods aren't even gods, and they're weak and helpless, and they can't deliver anything. And don't be enslaved again to them. So Paul's tone is driven in part by his concern that they be re-enslaved. Paul's concern is also, he says it like this, he said, I'm afraid that maybe I have labored in vain. Paul looks at what he's done there. He remembers having come to that area and having shared the gospel with them and told them about Jesus and seen them respond positively and seen their lives change. And he said, and I'm afraid that I've labored in vain. I'm afraid that it wasn't real. I'm afraid that it didn't mean what I thought it meant. I'm afraid that the evidences that I thought were evidences of newborn, newly regenerated hearts in God were something else. Now, I think it's important for some of us to wrestle with the implications of that. I grew up in a church culture that was probably not unlike the church culture in which some of you guys grew up. And in the church culture that I grew up in, it was not uncommon for a kid to come along at 12 years of age and somebody to say, hey, here's some things you should know. A, you're a sinner. B, Jesus died on the cross to save you from your sins. And 3, if you'll trust him, you're in good shape. You want to pray a prayer? Sure, I'll pray the prayer. And so a lot of 12-year-olds prayed a prayer. A lot of 12-year-olds hung out, stayed doing the church thing for a while, and then shot off into all kinds of directions and got involved in all kinds of other things. And what you would hear from time to time was, well, I don't know where Johnny is right now. I'm sorry, it's just a sample name, you know. I don't know where Sally is right now. Well, but it's okay because when they were 12, they prayed this prayer. And that is not the way Paul talks. That is not the way Paul talks. When Paul talks, he said, I'm afraid that maybe I labored in vain. Paul doesn't say, well, you guys prayed this prayer back when I was there, when I showed up in town, so everything's cool. It doesn't matter what you do. It's all set. You're in good shape because you prayed this prayer when we got there. Paul says, no. What I'm seeing in the way that you're living right now doesn't look like people whose lives have been changed. It doesn't look like people whose hearts have been transformed. And because of that, I'm looking around and saying, maybe this wasn't real. Maybe I labored in vain. And because of that, Paul's tone is one of urgency. The last thing that I think I want you to see in this couple of verses is quitting the race can look very religious. Quitting the race can look very religious. And it usually does. Not sometimes does, but it usually does. In my life of following Jesus for 50 years, for every pastor that I've seen have an affair and disappear from the scene, for every elder or deacon that I've seen do some kind of public sin that got them on the shame side of things and then see them walk away from their faith. For every one of those that I have seen, I've seen 50 people who have settled into a life of religious apathy. 50 people who kept coming to church, 50 people who showed up, 50 people who sang the songs, 50 people who did the drill, 50 people who showed up in formation, but 50 people who quit the race. And Paul is saying there is a very, very religious looking way of quitting the race. And I'm afraid, Galatian friends, that some of you are falling into that. Picking up at verse 12, Paul says, I entreat you, become as I am, for I also have become as you are. You did me no wrong. You know it was because of a bodily ailment that I preached the gospel to you at first. And though my condition was a trial to you, you did not scorn or despise me, but received me as an angel of God, as Christ Jesus. What then has become of your blessedness? For I testify to you that if possible, you would have gouged out your eyes and given them to me. And what Paul is saying here is the reason that I speak with urgency isn't just because I realize the danger of you guys following this gospel that's not a gospel at all. It's not just because I realize theologically the danger of abandoning the grace of Jesus and following this false gospel. But the reason that I speak with urgency is because I love you. The reason that I speak with urgency is because I care about you. The reason that I speak with urgency is the same reason that this dad got angry with his daughter when she fell down the steps, because he loves her, because she's his daughter. And Paul says, I love you guys. And Paul looks back and says, where is the blessedness that was there? You know, when Eugene was wrapping up last week, he talked about the fact that reborn hearts cry, Abba, Father. And reborn hearts crying, Abba, Father, are the the inkling of a newborn heart loving God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. That's the germ of it. That's what it looks like at the start, is this cry of Abba, Father. That is the new life. And Paul says, and I saw personally the evidence of you loving your brother as yourself in the way that you treated me. And Paul's saying, man, I love you guys, and I saw this change in your heart in the way that you loved God and the way that you loved me. And now what's happened? And picking up at verse 16, Paul says, have I become your enemy by telling you the truth? They make much of you, but for no good purpose. They want to shut you out, that you may make much of them. It is always good to be made much of for a good purpose, and not only when I am present with you. My little children, for whom I am again in the anguish of childbirth until Christ is formed in you. That's the tone. It's just my children, in whom I am in the anguish of childbirth until Christ is formed in you. Paul's concerned. Paul wants this for them. Paul wants them to endure. Paul wants them to stand. So what do we do with all of this? What do we do with this danger that we can start the race and not endure? This reality that not everybody who starts the race stays in the race. And this reality that quitting the course is not a change just of doctrinal perspective, but quitting the course is departing from God's eternal family. What do we do with that? I want to address this to those of you who are in the first few laps of your race in following Jesus. And maybe you're in the first few laps because you're young and you've known Jesus for just a short period of time because you're young. And that's great. That's me 50 years ago as a college student at the University of Georgia. Maybe you're on the first few laps because it's just something that you didn't see for a while, but it's for some reason, sometime later in life, the gospel made sense to you. Maybe you hadn't really heard it before, but sometime later in life, the gospel made sense to you, and maybe you're 40, 50, 60, but for whatever reason, it now makes sense, and you're following Jesus because the gospel is precious to you. Wherever, it doesn't matter what your age is, but I want to speak to those of you guys who are in the early laps of the race. And I want to encourage you with this. It is unavoidable that you will rub shoulders with people who have quit the race through apathy. It is unavoidable that you will rub shoulders with people who have settled into a religious pattern that is nothing more than checking boxes. It is unavoidable that that will happen. And my encouragement to you is do not be confused into thinking that that is what authentic faith in Jesus looks like. It is not. So let me give you a couple of things. Here's what I would suggest. Find people who look like this. Authentic Jesus followers carry around with them an awareness of their need for Jesus' grace and mercy. They never get past that. They never get to the point. It's been 50 years for me, and every day I wake up astounded that Jesus loves me in spite of who I am. Because I know that I think I've grown some over the 50 years, but I'm so aware of the things that aren't there yet. I'm so aware of those things. So look for people who treasure daily the grace and mercy of Jesus. And one of the ways that you will see that is look for people who are slow to condemn other people because they are aware themselves of their own need for grace and mercy in their own lives. Look for people who have a longing for God's eternal promise. Look for people who have an appetite for that. Look for people who anticipate that and desire that. Look for people who have joy in their relationship with Jesus, even when they're having bad days. I think it was Don Carson wrote a book that's talking about spiritual fruit, and he was asked the question, how much fruit is required in a life to be able to say with some confidence that that person is genuinely spiritually alive, which is a great question. And Don Carson's answer, which I thought was as profound as any I've heard, was some. Some. At least some. Look for people who have some fruit in their lives, some joy in Jesus in their lives, some sadness for sin in their lives, some love for people in their lives. They don't have to be perfect, but look for people like that and run with them the race that God has set before you. And don't be trapped and led into quitting the race and settling into people who show up and sit in chairs. Want more than that. Want more than that. Let me pray first. Father, I thank you that that everything that even as we talk about running this race, and even as we talk about enduring, and even as we talk about staying true to faith in your promises, that in every step of that, we're able to do that because of your grace. It never comes back to our ability. It never comes back to our strength. It never comes back to our flesh. That it is always just a response to your goodness. And so, Father, I thank you that we have that truth to rest in. Father, for every person who's here who's already running that race, I ask that you would allow us to sense and feel and express a heartfelt hunger for you. In your Son's name we pray.